A local election in Hong Kong delivers a devastating blow to Beijing. After months of anti-government protests, pro-China candidates are demolished in the latest vote. Chief Executive Carrie says she's got some serious thinking to do. But will that make any difference for demonstrators? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the landslide win by Hong Kong's pro-democracy camp. A local vote like this wouldn't normally get so much attention. But after almost 6 months of anti-government protests, all eyes were on Hong Kong's ballot boxes. Chief Executive Carrie claimed she had the support of a silent majority. Sunday's poll proved otherwise. Pro-democracy candidates won almost 90% of district council seats. Beijing responded by claiming the vote was sabotaged, and the result is a setback for the territory's democratic development. Now, while all this was going on, the streets were quiet. But one of the most dramatic standoffs of the past year had been taking place at Hong Kong's Polytechnic University. Protesters had barricaded themselves inside the campus after clashing with riot police. Authorities then wouldn't let them out, trapping them with dwindling food and water. That siege has essentially been brought to an end, with most escaping or being forced to surrender. But as Natalie Pahunen explains, the unrest still seems far from over.
Hong Kong's Polytechnic University transformed into a battleground. Demonstrators turned several of the city's campuses into protest sites. But the siege at Poly U lasted the longest, after protesters barricaded themselves inside and police surrounded the campus. It's come to an end now, but at what cost to a city already reeling from months of protests? Peaceful demonstrations started in June over a bill that would allow suspects to be extradited to mainland China. They've morphed into calls for political reform and increasingly violent clashes with police. The siege at Poly U marks a shift in tactics. Protests have tended to be fluid, with demonstrators moving from place to place. But all eyes were focused on what was happening at this one site and the fate of the young people inside it. As the siege stretched out, tear gas was fired at groups of protesters attempting to leave. Hundreds of them were arrested. They could face charges of rioting.
I think if you really go out and surrender, it's like you're showing you agree with the government and police what they're doing, like you've given up the fight.
Beyond the campus walls, another form of protest was taking shape. The vote for local politicians in the district council elections. Hong Kong's leader, Carrie had predicted her so-called silent majority of voters would use the opportunity to show they disapproved of the city's unrest. The peaceful day at the ballot box turned into a resounding victory for the pro-democracy camp. Pan-Democrats won nearly 90% of seats. Says her government will seriously reflect on the results.
After these 5 or 6 months, Hong Kong people have realized very clearly that Hong Kong could no longer tolerate this chaotic situation. Everybody wants to go back to their normal life.
Life at Poly U will slowly return to normal, but the protesters' demands remain, and the government hasn't offered any concessions. In Hong Kong, the political divisions still linger, and they seem more entrenched than ever before. Natalie Pahunen, The Newsmakers.
Well, we're joined now by a student leader and winner in the local election, Jordan Pang. He defeated the vice chairman of the biggest pro-Beijing party, the DAB, who'd represented the Saiwan district for 8 years. And solicitor Johnny Ip is the deputy spokesman of that pro-Beijing party, the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment and Progress of Hong Kong. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. So Jordan Pang, you're 21 years old. You defeated an experienced guy in his mid-40s. What was the secret to your success?
Well, I think I would like to say thank you to all the supporters in Saiwan district and my friends and my supporters from HKU and my family members, because well, the support mean a lot to me. And yeah, I think we have to have more youngsters to join the election and to express their views. It's a peaceful way to express their views during this movement. So, well, I think it's a good start.
Jordan, when you say it's a peaceful way to express their views, are you also accepting that when people take to the streets, there are also violent elements? Therefore, Carrie Lam might be right when she says that among the people taking to the streets, there's too much violence.
Well, I'm not rejecting the ways that the youngsters who join so-called violent protests. I think they're just using force, or we can maybe sometimes excessive force, but it's not violence, because we have to understand their motives. But they're just fighting for democracy, but not just like destroying all the things for the sake of destroying all the things. So, well, we have to understand their motives, and I think it's really important for them to understand what the youngsters they are thinking.
Okay, as we try to understand what the youngsters are thinking, let's go to our other guest now, Johnny Ip. So, looking at these election results, 90% of 452 district council seats were won by pro-democracy candidates such as Jordan. After months of protests, there's this local vote. It's as clear as day. When you look at those results, Johnny, don't you feel as if you are on the wrong side of history by being pro-Beijing?
Well, we have to look at the results. There are still 40% of the voters who support the non-violence campaign and do support our camp. So it's only because the electoral system that we are talking about, the first past the post system, that lead to this result of having 85% of the seats being taken by the pan-Democrat. But if we look at all the votes in general, the total number of votes, we have to consider that there are still 42% of the general public, or at least the voters, that support our camp. And
but
they
it's still,
not only support.
It's still a minority view. Certainly, it's still a minority view. 42% is 8% less than 50%.
Well, you cannot ignore the 42% of the general public. Yeah, it's true that there are 58% of the voters who support the pan-Democrat, but you still cannot ignore the 42% of the general public. They still taken a huge portion of the public view. So in this consideration, I guess that there is a huge support that that should be ease to the violence protests on the street.
Okay, so let me ask Jordan Pang then. The district that you are representing is a hotspot, right? We've seen some extraordinary scenes of violence there in Saiwan. Somebody was shot at point blank range there. Some of the protesters were very violent there as well. As you take office, yes, it's a small local election, and one of the reasons why we have you on the show because it's a big deal, and it probably says a lot about the broader picture here. Can you convince the people in your district who don't support the protesters that you also represent them?
I have the same views that we have to fight for democracy and our core values like human rights and rule of law and something like that. And also, if there's a protest in Saiwan district, I will surely protect them and to do my best to calm the police down and try not to, well, to let the people get hurt.
So,
or,
Jordan, you say if there's, if
I
you
will
say
offer
if there's a protest,
my help in any.
This is interesting because I wonder, after this election win, do you believe that maybe it's time for the people not to take to the streets? Maybe this is an opportunity now to solidify the win, and that on the timeline of protests, there's been an achievement now at the polls, and maybe people don't actually have to take to the streets anymore against Carrie Lam?
I think it's not about the number of votes, but it's like what's right and what's wrong. So as long as they're fighting for something correct, we don't have to look at the numbers.
Johnny Ip, Jordan believes that he's on the side of right and the other side is wrong. What do you think?
Well, I don't think that we have to share this view. We just have to use the election as a kind of way to calm the whole society. We have to say no to violence. I guess Jordan will share the view that it's time for us to cease all the violence on the street. Our society needs to move on, and this election or the result is a good opportunity for us to move on. If the protesters still using this violence method on the street, then the whole society will not be able to move forward in a calm way. So I do urge the newly elected councillors to do something, to at least, try to be the bridge that the councillors' duty has to do, that shares the view of Carrie Lam and shares what the public actually think about those violence or vandalism on the street. I guess that it's time to end all the violence, and it's time for the whole society to move on to, well, at least to a bright future.
Johnny?
And they have taken many seats in the district, and yes.
Okay, I'm interested to hear your response to what the Chinese have said. Johnny, Chinese state media, quiet initially, and then after a little trickle, it was a deluge of criticism after this local election. So we heard from China Daily in an editorial. They said the result of Sunday's district council election marks a setback for Hong Kong's democratic development, as the results were skewed by the illegal activities of the opposition camp to the benefit of their candidates. They also said the protests severely disrupted the election process. And then Xinhua blamed foreign forces and said the election fell victim to the social unrest. It sounds like sour grapes from Beijing. Johnny, do you accept that? Do you endorse that? Because it sounds as if Beijing is quite rattled by this democratic process that's happening in Hong Kong, even at a local level.
If we look at the 1.5 months of election campaign, we have seen all sorts of vandalism against the current councillors' offices. We have seen vandalism on the street against all kinds of public transport and on the road pedestrian as well. And we have seen violent or physical and verbal threat against the candidates from both camps. Well, we have seen petrol bomb being thrown at candidates from our camp, a knife stabbing a solicitor who is also a candidate. And we have also seen our election campaign materials have been destroyed, demolished, or vandalized by all kinds of anonymous person. And we have to consider and take into account of all this act to consider whether it's a fair election.
I see.
We will look into all this, and we also ask the government to look into all this as well.
So let me ask, Jordan Pang, did you win because of vandalism and violence and intimidation?
Of course not. Yeah, no.
Okay, that's enough. That's enough of an answer. I want to ask you, Jordan, about the Polytechnic University and the aftermath of it. The standoff is all but over. Tell me about the lesson that you've learned between the protesters and the authorities. What lesson did you learn after this week-long standoff?
Well, I learned that the government, they're not accepting the people's views and their ideas. And, well, they're just trying to use a more aggressive way to suppress this movement. well, it's a wrong way. Obviously, we can see that the winning of the majority seats of the Pan Democrats it's just the result of the violence that the government used. So we can see the government they have been going in a wrong way. So they have to listen to the people's demands. Well, but that's not enough. You have to take actions, like to answer to those 5 demands.
Johnny, the government is not listening and it's not giving proper answers. Is that fair?
Well, it's not fair because the election, this district council election, is also a mean for all the general public to voice out or express their opinion. We do see that there's a majority of people that of voters who do not like or do not agree with the government policy. But there's no means that that is one single factor that the demands by the protester on the street. There are also problems or issues regarding the property prices, housing issues, and other careers problems with the youngster or with other middle-aged people in Hong Kong. So we do agree that we need to urge the government to do more on the policy development in order to answer all those in the public, in the society, that answer what they are crying for, and the government need to look closely into all these problems. And it's time for them to answer some of them, like housing and social welfare issues as well.
Right. Okay. And this is all set against the backdrop of some bigger geopolitical issues. The Secretary of State of the United States, Pompeo, slamming China over human rights abuses in Hong Kong. The next time, hopefully, on the Newsmakers, we'll discuss some of those geopolitical implications. But for the moment, let me thank you both, Jordan Pang and Johnny Ip. Thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Bye-bye. Tucked inside an archipelago in the South Pacific Ocean, the tiny island of Bougainville, a province of Papua New Guinea, could become the world's newest nation. More than 20 years after a brutal civil war killed thousands, many believe a historic independence referendum marks the start of the healing process. Bougainvillians are being asked to choose if they want greater autonomy from Papua New Guinea or complete independence. Over the next 2 weeks, hundreds of thousands will have made that choice. And while early indications are the vast majority will vote for independence, it may take a while before that reality is realized. Adam Pletz has more.
Bougainville is voting on whether to become independent in a referendum that began on Saturday and runs for 2 weeks. The South Pacific island is located about 600 kilometers east of mainland Papua New Guinea, from which it is seeking to break away. Since the year 2000, Bougainville has had an autonomous government after peace talks brought a 10-year civil war to an end in 1998. The war pitched Bougainville separatist militias against Papua New Guinea security forces. As many as 20,000 people were killed, about a tenth of the population.
After the referendum, the Bougainville Peace Agreement is quite clear. If the vote for independence is overwhelmingly in support of independence, the national government and the APG will have to consult on nothing other than the option number 2, and that is independence.
The vote is expected to strongly favour independence, with the results due out on December the 20th. But Papua New Guinea's government will have to ratify the referendum. Failure to do so could lead to renewed violence. In the days before the polls opened, there was an amnesty on surrendering weapons, and former separatist fighters met with Papua New Guinea security forces in a show of reconciliation.
Today was a good day for world peace. It's not often that we hear reports that people have put down their weapons and sought ways to mend fences and carry forward establishing peace.
Bougainville is heavily reliant on Papua New Guinea and only generates 14% of its own revenues. Before the war, the Panguna copper mine contributed 45% of Papua New Guinea's export revenues, but Bougainville accounts for less than 5% of Papua New Guinea's population. Once the world's largest open-cast mine, it was a main cause of the civil war, as Bougainvillians resented subsidizing the central government. The war led to the mine's closure, but the autonomous Bougainville government says it's considering reopening Panguna. That sparked concerns it too could reignite conflict over land claims. Governments in the region also fear a breakaway could encourage other separatist movements, leading to instability in the South Pacific. If the world's newest nation is going to be born, what birth pains may it bring? And is Bougainville ready? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
To get more on this, I'm joined now by Maurizio Claudio, who you saw there in Adam's report. He is Bougainville's chief referendum officer. Maurizio, good to have you on the program. Tell me what this means for the people of Bougainville.
Yes, good to be here. Well, the referendum marks the next stage in the implementation of the Bougainville Peace Agreement signed in 2001 between the autonomous Bougainville government and the government of Papua New Guinea. The BPA put an end to a 10-year conflict which claimed the lives of maybe 10 to 20,000 people, and which was the bloodiest conflict in the South Pacific since World War II. Since then, the BPA, the Bougainville Peace Agreement, has been successful in maintaining the peace on Bougainville, and this referendum is a continuation of the Bougainville Peace Agreement towards a final negotiated outcome on Bougainville's political status. At stake are two choices before the voters. One is greater autonomy, and the other one is independence, outright independence from Papua New Guinea. So the referendum is a continuation of a long-standing peace process, and after the results are returned to the national government, then the two governments will consult on the results, and the final ratification and on the outcome will go to the national parliament.
Right. And I know a lot of people in our international audience could be forgiven for not knowing much about Bougainville, an island that's probably, populated by about 250,000 people, right? For those who would look at the referendum and ask, well, why is it that it's about greater autonomy or complete independence? Why is there not an option for the status quo? Can we say that enough people on Bougainville believe that things as they are should not stay as they are?
Yes, the options on the referendum ballot, the options before the voters were negotiated by the two governments. Bougainville right now enjoys a great level of autonomy, but the two choices negotiated by the two governments was even greater autonomy, or there has been a separatist feeling on Bougainville since the 70s. In fact, when Papua New Guinea declared its independence in 1975, Bougainvillians similarly made a unilateral declaration of independence. Of course, that wasn't recognized by the international community, but ever since then, there has been a separatist feeling on Bougainville. The choices on the referendum ballot are a reflection of not only the choices agreed by the two governments, but a recognition of the separatist feeling on Bougainville.
Mm-hmm. And there's that civil war where thousands of people died, the peace deal of 2001. A lot of people obviously have fresh memories of the conflict. A lot of people were actively involved, and a lot of people were victims of the conflict. As an outsider yourself there and being involved in the referendum process, does it feel for many people as if this is a sort of bookend to the conflict? Does it feel like they can finally close a chapter to the conflict?
Yes, it feels like a bookend, like the end of a chapter, but also the beginning of a new chapter. The Bougainvillians, the people of Bougainville, have been waiting for this moment for decades. And this referendum has been in the making for years, and we ourselves at the Bougainville Referendum Commission have been preparing for months. But it's also, as I said, the beginning of a new chapter. This referendum is non-binding, so the results will go to the two governments, and then it will be for the two governments to negotiate a final outcome. The leaders have said that what's important, what's non-negotiable, is the continued peace on Bougainville and the quality of that final resolution or final decision, negotiated outcome on the part of the two governments.
And just practically, tell me about some of the difficulties that you've encountered in trying to ensure that this runs smoothly, because as far as I understand, there are a lot of remote villages as well over there.
Yes, even in the best of circumstances, Bougainville presents significant challenges to undertaking an electoral event of this scope and importance. Bougainville suffers from poor infrastructure, communications are scarce, there's highland communities, there's atolls, coupled with low educational and human development levels. They all conspire to make Bougainville a very challenging environment. In addition to that, we have, Bougainville sits not far from the equator. We have torrid tropical weather, which is highly unpredictable. So all these factors make running an election a considerable effort and a significant enterprise.
Okay, we're watching closely and we're waiting to see which way the people will vote. Maurizio, Claudio, thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. See you next time.